Hi everyone, Eric the Car Guy here. Some of the most frequently asked questions that I get are about no start issues. And it's important to make the distinction, is it a no crank, no start? Meaning when you turn the key, nothing happens. In other words, the engine doesn't turn over, maybe you just hear a click, maybe the lights on the dash dim, or maybe absolutely nothing happens at all. So that's a no crank, no start issue. Or is it a crank no start issue, meaning that you turn the key and you can hear the engine spinning over, but it's not starting. So you have to make that distinction. Behind me we have the Civic that we put the engine in last year, and it has a no crank, no start issue. So I'm going to walk through some of the steps that I go through whenever I'm confronted with this problem. And for that, let's start with the basics. So we want to verify the complaint. So let's get in, turn the key, and see what happens for ourselves. And by the way, for those of you that are wondering, this is a 1999 Civic DX with 207,000 miles on it. So now I'm going to stick the key in and see what happens when I turn it. As you can hear, you just hear a click, but nothing is happening. And you can watch the lights on the dash go out when you turn the key. Now in a situation like this, the number one suspect is the battery. That's basically the heart of the electrical system, and it's the thing that basically starts the reaction of your engine when you turn the key. So a lot of times with a no crank, no start issue, a battery is the first place to look. So here's a quick check for you, just to, without grabbing a battery charger or anything, just to see if the battery and its connections, that's an important note. Not just the battery, a lot of times it could just be a battery connection that's the issue. Aside from all that, just a quick check of the battery and its connections, or just turn the headlights on and see how they look. If they're nice and bright, it usually means that the battery and its connections are okay. But if they're dim or they don't come on hardly at all, it could indicate that the battery or its connections are having a problem. Okay, you don't need your key in the ignition to turn the headlights on. So just turn them on and then have a look at what you've got. Now as you can see, these headlights are nice and bright, so we can reasonably assume that our battery and its connections are okay. Now let's open the hood and have a look around. And yes, this Civic does have some classic hood latch issues. Now let's just start with a good visual inspection of the battery and its connections. This one has a little bit of corrosion. This is not a valid hold down for the battery, but I suppose it does its job. But just check to see if the connections are loose at all, because many times, even though your battery may be good, as soon as you put a high amp load like the starter on it, the connection doesn't close. So it's a good idea just to wiggle this stuff around and see if it's loose. We're all right here. So now let's turn our attention to the starter. I think it's very important to note that these are just quick checks, okay? There's no substitute for actually getting out a load tester or a conductance tester and testing the battery itself. Also doing a voltage drop. You can actually check out my video on starter diagnosis for that. But these are just quick checks to run through before you actually break out a battery tester or something. You might be able to find something just doing this. So another thing to also note is that in times like this, check all the fuses, not just the fuses inside the car, but a lot of times there's another fuse box outside the car, and just run through them and see if you can find any blown fuses. Sticking a test light on the back of them is a real good idea. Many times you can fix a problem like this just by replacing a blown fuse. So don't overlook the simple things. In fact, that's what I'm trying to stress in this, is that you want to really just keep your diagnosis simple. Don't try to overcomplicate it and say that it's a bunch of sensors or something that's causing the problem. Don't condemn anything unless you have evidence of that. So before you have any evidence, just keep it simple. Look at the easy stuff. Now let's take a look at that starter. Now the starter and its connections on this vehicle are located just down behind the distributor, down underneath here. And it's not likely the electrical connections or whatever came loose. If you recently did some work, that is a possibility. But something that I like to try in this situation, particularly when I hear a loud click when I'm turning the key, is I like to tap on the starter with a hammer. Now, starter people that make starters and things don't recommend doing this. But I've found that sometimes if you tap on the starter a few times, many times it will reestablish the connection and you'll be able to start the vehicle and get to where you need to be until you can replace it. So I'm just going to get down in here with a hammer and give it a few taps and see what we have. So I'm just going to take, actually I've got a brass hammer here so that I don't damage it. And I'm just going to reach up, whack the starter a few times. And then I'm going to try to start. I don't really think it's the starter in this vehicle. I actually think that there may be a mechanical problem with the engine, because if there is a mechanical problem with the engine and it cannot be rotated, or the engine itself cannot rotate because of some mechanical malfunction, then the starter's not going to be able to rotate the engine. So right now, what I'd like to do is the next step, which is verify that the engine cannot rotate on its own. And the way I'll do that is I'll just remove the spark plugs, and then I will try to turn the crankshaft by hand. And if you remember from the other videos, this engine rotates counterclockwise, so you want to be sure to rotate the engine in the normal direction of rotation. But, and I'm not saying you have to do this every time, because I'm certain that the starter is getting the power and ground that it needs. I am also reasonably certain that the battery has enough power to run the starter. So this leads me to think that, okay, it could be a bad starter, or there could be, like I say, some mechanical issue. And like I said, my instinct tells me that this could be a mechanical issue. So why don't we verify that? Well, let's remove the spark plugs and let's rotate the engine, or attempt to rotate the engine, and see where we're at. Now, some of you may be asking a very legitimate question at this point, and that is, Eric, why are you taking the plugs out now? Well, the engine rotates a lot easier without the spark plugs in it. To be honest, you don't have to take the spark plugs out in order to verify that the engine is moving or not moving. I'm just doing it so that I can get a look inside the engine. Also, I'm going to take a look and see if there's any oil in the dipstick, because if I don't see any oil in the dipstick, well, that could clue me into something a lot more tragic. So before I pull the first plug, I'm actually going to pull out the dipstick and take a look and see if it's got any oil in it. And as I suspected, there is no oil on this dipstick at all to speak of. Are you seeing where this is going? I kind of already knew where it was going before I started shooting the video, but I thought I'd go through the motions in case you find yourself in the same place. So let's take a look at these spark plugs. That right there, that crusty stuff, that means it's burning oil. That's cylinder number 1. Cylinder number 2, same story. You see that crusty residue? That's burning oil. Cylinder number 3 also looks like it's burning oil. Cylinder number 4 looks normal. This is what a normal plug would look like. So we have no oil in the dipstick, and we have evidence of it burning oil on 3 of the cylinders. And the last time the engine went, it was pretty much due to neglect, and it ran out of lubrication, and it looks like the same thing might have happened. The next step is to get a ratchet on that crank bolt and see if we can rotate the engine by hand. You don't have to jack up the vehicle in order to do this, but I just I took the steering wheel and turned it all the way left. That way I've got access into this area here. I have a 17 millimeter on the end of a 1/2 inch setup, and I'm going to stick it right through the side here and onto the crank bolt, see if I can spin it. And Honda's been nice, and they've given us access to the splash shield and everything. So I'm just gonna slide right into this. There we go. Let's see if we can rotate that. It's not looking good, people. I can't rotate it. It goes counterclockwise. I can't rotate it in a counterclockwise direction. Notice I'm pushing with my open hand so I don't punch the floor. That engine's not moving. Okay, I'm gonna do one last check with my really long screwdriver, since these spark plugs are already out of here. And I'm just gonna insert the screwdriver all the way down through the threads of the spark plug till I come into contact with the top of the piston. And right there is the contact with the top of that piston. Now, come down there with the second piston. About the same on this, because the way a 4-cylinder works is the 2 cylinders in the center come up and down at the same time, and the 2 outer cylinders the same thing. So this one here is all the way at the top. These are down in, almost to the bottom. This one here is halfway down. Plus it's got sort of a hollow thud. Hear that? Pretty much, I'm thinking broken connecting rod, which means that the engine is locked up and damaged and needs to be replaced once again. It's unfortunate. In fact, I'm actually able to move that piston down a little bit, which pretty much says that connecting rod is toast. Let's sum this up. Okay, at this point I think we can reasonably conclude that there's a connecting rod broken inside the engine and the engine needs to be replaced yet again. Got it run low on oil. Lack of lubrication pretty much spells the end of any engine. Now, one of the things that you can also do is stick a light down into those cylinders and take a look at the tops of the pistons. In fact, that's what I did initially just to have a look, but there's no way I can bring you, the camera, in there to see what I'm seeing, so it's just so much easier to do it this way. If you do have, and this is the takeaway here, when you have a no start condition, please differentiate between whether it's a crank no start or a no crank no start. This is a no crank no start. The engine didn't turn over at all. It could have been a starter, it could have been a battery problem, it could have been a lot of things, but basically the conclusion is the engine does not have the ability to rotate, and therefore the starter cannot rotate the engine. So the starter's not bad, the engine is. So that's always a possibility, and this is how you would verify and see if you have a seized up engine. So we've got our work cut out for us, but we're not going to cover that in this video. Actually, we've already covered this in another video, so if you want to see the engine replacement on this very vehicle, I've got an engine series on that. I may touch on it again. This time I think we're going to go over the remanufactured unit, one that doesn't burn so much oil, because it seems that this owner is not very good about checking the oil. And, you know, come on, think about it. If you buy an engine, it's reasonable to assume that it shouldn't burn oil, but this one did. I am Eric the Car Guy. You can always visit me at EricTheCarGuy.com, or you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. And now on Google+. And around here, I close with be safe, have fun, and of course, stay dirty. See you later, people.